The Perennial Philosophy is a 1946 work of mystical theology by the British author Aldous Huxley. Born in Surrey in 1894, Huxley was the grandson of the man who invented agnosticism as a modern doctrine and who served as a fierce defender of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. He was a pacifist, and in 1937 he moved to California, where he was inducted into Vedanta Hinduism and where he stayed until his death in 1963 at the age of 69. The Perennial Philosophy is an attempt to express the common core of the world's great religions. It identifies an absolute principle of all existence that invites human beings individually to participate in a mystical communion with it in which their selves are erased. Direct knowledge of the divine ground of all existence, Huxley writes in Chapter 2, cannot be had except by union, and union cannot be achieved except by the annihilation of the self-regarding ego, which is the barrier between the thou and the that. Huxley's method is to provide extensive quotations from the world's great religions, principally Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam, and build his claims around them in the form of a commentary. It's one of the book's weaknesses that Judaism rarely appears, especially given its publication date just after World War II, but it's unlikely that its inclusion would have altered Huxley's conclusions. For a book with the word philosophy in the title, there's very little philosophizing. Huxley proceeds on the assumption that there is something like a God, although officially he was an agnostic, and even that phenomena like ESP and telepathy have a degree of scientific credibility. He's at his weakest when he attempts to bolster his conclusions with contemporary science, as for example in Chapter 8, entitled Religion and Temperament, where he makes extensive use of a now forgotten psychologist called Sheldon. Having said that, the Perennial Philosophy is an impressive work, and it's difficult to think there's nothing in what Huxley's saying. The real interest lies in the quotations rather than the commentary. As well as Eckhart, the Cloud of Unknowing, and Adi Shankara, we get long contributions from Mahayana Buddhism, which Huxley prefers to Theravada, and also from a neglected 18th century Anglican priest called William Law. Huxley has an axe to grind on Law's behalf. Students of English literature are forced to read the graceful journalism of Steele and Addison, he writes in Chapter 11. They're expected to know all about the minor novels of Defoe and the tiny elegances of Matthew Prior. They can pass all their examinations summa cum laude without having once looked into the writings of a man who was not only a master of English prose, but one of the most interesting figures of his period. He has no time for political notions of progress, the perfectibility of man, or technologism. A society is good, he asserts in Chapter 27, to the extent that it renders contemplation possible for its members, and the existence of at least a minority of contemplatives is necessary for the well-being of any society. The term perennial philosophy has its roots in the Renaissance, particularly in the writings of Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, both of whom argued that Christianity could be assimilated to Platonism. It took a step further in the 19th century, extending its coverage to the world's great religions with theosophy and transcendentalism, and in the 20th century with traditionalism. Huxley gives it its most succinct and accessible form. The fact that Huxley experimented with drugs, along with his pacifism, his brief mentorship of Timothy Leary, his high regard for Eastern religions, and his conviction that we must start thinking of human problems in ecological terms rather than in terms of power politics, made him something of a hero to the countercultural rebels of the 1960s. Partly because our own age has become much more sceptical about religious truth claims, and partly because Huxley succeeded so well in fulfilling his own clearly defined brief, the Perennial Philosophy, despite in some places its oppressive 1940s feel, has remained a unique book. It'll likely stay that way for a long time yet.